Hello everyone, welcome to Chicago Prohibition Tours. My name is Jonathan Notek. I'm one of the founders and owners of the tour. We are so excited to be partnering with M&M Limo to give you this new experience. And before we get started, I want to give you just a little bit of an idea of what you're in for today. So you're going to be going to three places, three of our regular stops on our normal tour. We're going to give you the history of each place and talk about the names affiliated with each place. You're going to get a drink and some food. You're going to have a great time. But first, I want to explain to you a little bit about what Prohibition was. So to really understand Prohibition and how it came about, you first have to understand how much we drank as an American public. In the mid-1830s, the average American over the age of 15 years old was consuming 88 bottles of whiskey a year. And that roughly translates to 6 shots of whiskey every single day. Our founding fathers were some of the biggest drinkers around, and we just really enjoyed our booze. There was a British admiral that once said there's nothing an American can't do without having a drink first. So when we think of Prohibition, we often wonder how something like that could have been passed and lasted for 13 years. Well, there's no one thing that causes Prohibition, there's no one reason why Prohibition takes effect, and there's no one reason why it lasts so long. It's an amalgamation of things. And it would take a long time for me to explain exactly how it happened, but I want you guys to relax and have some fun. So we're really going to talk about only a few key things that led up to that point. We covered the first one already, and that is the idea that Americans drank and drank and drank. So what you have is two big movements happen right about the same time that sort of kick off this idea for Prohibition. The first is a religious movement. Now, if any of you are religious people, drinking, particularly getting drunk, for some religions is a complete no-no, and almost in every religion, it's frowned upon a little bit. And so you have a religious movement that goes out. It's a largely Protestant Methodist movement, and what they are preaching for is what some people call the eradication of an evil. They view alcohol as the root of a lot of problems in the United States. And quite frankly, when you have people drinking that much, you do have a rampant amount of alcoholism. So they weren't entirely on the wrong path. This is not an anti-religion speech. I certainly don't mean to give you that impression. This is not knocking religion. The second thing, and I also want to make sure that I'm clear on this, that I'm not knocking this movement either, is the women's movement. We are not trying to blame Prohibition on women here, not in the least. However, for women, before suffrage is passed, and if you're familiar, the 18th Amendment is Prohibition, the 19th Amendment, it's women's right to vote. Before women had the right to vote, before suffrage, women had basically no rights in the United States. If you were married, you're kind of your husband's property, and he can treat you however he wants to. And a lot of these women are treated really horribly. And you may see where I'm going with this already. The worst is when their husbands, fathers, brothers have been drinking. So alcohol for them is a huge problem because it's fueling a lot of this really bad behavior that they are bearing the brunt of. But there's a couple of factors that go into it as well. The first of which is the immigrant movement. So at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, you have this massive influx of immigrants into the United States. And these are Irish, Italian, German, Polish, Czech. Well, what do all these cultures have in common? You guessed it, they're incredibly good drinkers. And they're bringing their booze with them. The Irish, the whiskey, the Italians, the wine, and the Germans are bringing the beer. And it is the Germans who make the biggest splash, no pun intended, as far as that goes. Men like Miller, Blatz, Pabst, Schlitz become some of the biggest private business owners in the United States. And Adolphus Busch, Budweiser, is the biggest of all of them. They are making money hand over fist. They are so widely popular that on the night of Adolphus Busch's 35th wedding anniversary, there's a toast held in his honor nationwide. So you have a dual problem here as some people see it. First, you have these non-English speaking immigrants starting to take over the country. And second, their booze and their drinking habits are influencing the rest of the nation as well. For a religious movement and a women's movement concerned with the abuse that alcohol causes, this is just simply not going to fly. And so these movements start to take off. What they actually have in the religion and in the women's movement is a lot of these people are teachers. And so they are actually starting to push for prohibition to be taught in schools as a curriculum. And they put in books that have largely nonsense. Things like 1 sip of alcohol will start to wear away the lining of your esophagus. 1 sip of alcohol and you're hooked. You are down the path to total drunkenness. Now, for children who are easily scared and who don't have good resources at the time, this is an effective scare tactic. So now prohibition is starting to be taught, and temperance is starting to be taught to a younger generation. They're starting to learn that booze is bad. So there's a couple of other things that happen. First, we talked about booze being such a big commodity. Well, commodities come along with money, and it's making as much money then as it's making today. In fact, some state governments are making 70% of their annual income based on beer taxes alone. And the big brewers, they don't get prohibition, and they don't think it's a possibility. They don't get it because they don't see themselves as a problem. It's beer. It's liquid bread. It's a breakfast drink. And make no mistake about it, people did drink beer for breakfast back then. The other thing is, we talked about that in 70% of a state's income, you can't get rid of us. You need us. You're going to go bankrupt without us. Well, 2 big things happen. First, the national income tax law, the federal income tax law, the 16th Amendment is passed. And suddenly, the United States government has a brand new piggy bank from which to withdraw funds. They don't need the big brewers anymore. It's nice. We'll take it, but we don't need it. And the brewers lose their monetary influence, which is, as we all know, the most influential of influences. And so seizing on an opportunity, the religious groups and the women's groups, they double down their efforts. They hold marches in Washington, D.C. They really start to go for the jugular. There's one last big thing that happens. The United States of America enters World War I. And if you know your history, it's against Germany. Well, guess who suddenly becomes very unpopular in the United States? Big business German brewers. And Congress even opens up investigations into the big brewers as spies for the German Kaiser. There's a temporary ban on the sale of grain to the big brewers. So now they can't make their product. Nobody trusts them. They've lost their monetary influence. This thing looks like it might actually happen. Now, I know what you're saying. Not everybody could be fighting for prohibition, right? There had to be some pushback. Well, of course there was. There was plenty of what we would call wet politicians everywhere. And they just didn't see the writing on the wall. They just didn't think it was possible. So much so that after the Congress signed off on it and the president signed off on it, if you know anything about politics and specifically how amendments get ratified, it's not just enough for the Congress to approve it and the president to sign off. The states then need to individually vote on it, and you need a 2/3 state majority. In that case, it's about 36 states. So they say, fine, go find your 36 states. You've got 7 years to get it done, 84 months, which seems like a lot of time. Why give them that amount of time, right? Well, because, like I said, they just don't get it. They just don't see it. And they vastly underestimated their competition. It took the dries, those are the people that want prohibition, dries obviously being, no booze, wet being plenty of booze. It took the dries 13 months to find the 36 states needed. In just over a year, Nebraska became the 36th state to ratify prohibition on January 16th of 1919. The law would go into effect 1 year later on January 17th of 1920, which is also an important date in Prohibition history. Now, really quickly, before we go on, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to give you a minute to think about it. Well, not a minute, maybe a couple of seconds. Do you know why January 17th is also an important date in Prohibition history? I can feel you looking at each other, trying to figure it out. It's okay if you don't know. Most people on our tours don't know. January 17th of 1920 just so happens to be Al Capone's 21st birthday. Prohibition began on Capone's 21st birthday. How about that little coincidence? Even though there weren't drinking age restrictions back then, still kind of a fun thing. So that's how Prohibition comes about. It's a movement that takes literally 100 years. It starts way back in the mid 1800s and it takes all the way until 1920 to get started. So sit back, relax. You're going to learn about some gangsters. You're going to learn about some places and some general Prohibition history. We're excited that you're here with us, and have a good time, guys. Thanks for coming out.